Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, July 6th, 2021, and today I'm going to be talking about the New York City mayoral election in which Eric Adams is officially the projected winner by the Associated Press and the New York Times, where we can actually see here that it came down to a percentage of just 1 point between Eric Adams, the sort of mayor-elect. Obviously, the regular election does need to be held in November, but knowing New York City's overwhelmingly Democratic population and overwhelming Democratic history in 2013 and 2017, Eric Adams is surely on a pathway to be reelected. Kathryn Garcia was the other person that we sort of knew at this point was going to be that runner-up, or not necessarily the runner-up, but the second place candidate. I mean, Eric Adams had a larger lead. I will say that, had a larger lead that we expected to possibly be taken down as the days progressed. The betting markets had fluctuated back and forth between Garcia and Adams. We didn't really know who was going to win, but it was a pretty substantial showing / performance for Kathryn Garcia, given that she started out with just 19.6% of the vote in the first round versus Eric Adams at 30.8%. Now, this was a very contentious primary, and you can see here that many people announced and many people did end up on that ballot for the ranked choice voting. The reason why we don't see the same amount of votes for the for the ranked choice final round versus the first round is because you could only pick up to 5 candidates. So some people didn't even pick Eric Adams or Kathryn Garcia, which left over 100,000 votes unable to be counted in that final, ballot choice, but the first round is the overall turnout number. And the reason why it took so long, and I'm sure that many of you guys might remember my live stream from a while back where we actually covered this race. This was held around mid-June, nearing the end of June. It was a time period in which we sort of knew that a lot of the results would be released, but we weren't going to have an indication as to who won because the New York City Board of Elections promised us the first round of results on the 29th of July. Now, they had to retract their numbers. They made a number of missteps. It was a very difficult primary on their part to not necessarily hold, but just because of a number of missteps on behalf of the Board of Elections here, that they made so many mistakes that it was just a primary that was seemingly difficult, at least on their end. And it wasn't as if they weren't prepared. I mean, New York City certainly has held elections of similar capacity, had higher turnout elections in the past. So this was just simply mistakes, multiple ones at that, made by the Board of Elections that prolonged this process. In addition, they didn't count the absentee ballots and publish them until today, even though this election was held in June of 2021. In addition, these absentee ballots were allowed to be received up to the 29th, so some of them might have been able to be sent in then. Obviously needed to be postmarked by the 22nd, but they could have been received by the 29th, and then once they were counted, which took a little bit longer than the, of course, Election Day ballots, that's when they could start releasing the numbers. But what we know so far is sort of the breakdown as the ranked choice voting got to the 6th round. And the reason why the 6th round is so important is because that's when Andrew Yang was eliminated. Andrew Yang received 14.8% of the vote in round number 6. In round number 7, they advanced on Maya Wiley at 29%, Kathryn Garcia at 30.4%, and Eric Adams at 40.5%. So what you'll see here is that essentially there was a 1.4% difference between Maya Wiley and Kathryn Garcia. And it seems that a significant portion of Maya Wiley's votes went into the inactive ballots column. Now, for Andrew Yang, he was ranked possibly a first choice for the same amount of people that ranked him in around round number 6 as the votes went on. He started out with 12.2%, ended at 14.8%. Garcia started at 19.6 and ended at 49.5. Now, of course, she's going to do better because the rounds did continue, but I will say Andrew Yang did not have any significant upticks once we reached round 6. Garcia did, and Wiley did as well, around the same performance of around a boost of around 4 or 5 points for these candidates. But by the time round 7 hit, this was when the progressive vote sort of split off. Eric Adams was largely viewed as a centrist, Garcia was viewed in a slightly more left-leaning but also centrist type of capacity, and Wiley here was viewed as the progressive. Now, you'll notice that a significant portion of Maya Wiley's votes did go to Kathryn Garcia, but just the right amount went to Eric Adams. A lot of the reason why Garcia was able to jump up significantly was because of the increased vote from Yang and Wiley. And had Wiley been in this second place position by round number 7, who knows what the results would have been. Kathryn Garcia would have received a large portion of the vote, but maybe a lot of it would have gone to inactive ballots as they did for Maya Wiley. And I do think that had those inactive ballots been counted on between Eric Adams and Kathryn Garcia probably would have won this primary just because of the vote split. If you add in a larger amount, it'll probably be enough to bump her up over that 8,000, 9,000 vote deficit between the two candidates. But it was an exceptionally close race. We know now after the absentees have been counted that Kathryn Garcia did receive 49.5% of the vote, but not enough to win. Eric Adams goes on to win. Someone who I would say became a frontrunner sort of last minute relative to when some of these people had announced that they were running in New York City's mayoral election. What you'll notice here is that Adams did have a pretty significant start out. He began as soon as the polls were around at around 15%, in second place above everybody else. Adam Stringer was in third place, and then it went down to Maya Wiley, and then the rest hovered around below 5%. But Andrew Yang was number 1. Andrew Yang had that name recognition from the 2020 election, peaking at support of around 26-27% of support in the first past the post polls. And what that exactly means is just pretty much the first round. Pretty much, if this was a plurality election, here's who's leading. And looking at the final results here, you'll see that Andrew Yang dipped down to eventually 4th place. Garcia ended up in 3rd place. Wiley ended up in 2nd place, and Adams ended up winning. Now, this wasn't exactly wrong. In fact, some of these numbers seem to be pretty much spot on. Andrew Yang, most notably, Kathryn Garcia, Maya Wiley, and Eric Adams weren't too far off from what the results actually were in the first round. But by the time we reached the final round, we didn't have any numbers that pitted the two candidates against each other. When you take a look at the head-to-head polls, Eric Adams and Kathryn Garcia never faced off against each other, which also might be an indicator that some of these polling firms and pretty much the general public did not expect it to be a final result between Garcia and Adams. In fact, Garcia was polled against Yang. Garcia was polled not by against any other people, which was quite surprising. It seems that not many people expected her to be in that final round against Eric Adams. And when you look at the ranked choice polls, sometimes you do get into a position where they do have the two face off against each other just by elimination or just by reaching a final round. But in many cases, it was exceptionally close. Eric Adams defeats Kathryn Garcia in one, loses in another, wins in one. So it is interesting to see how these numbers did fluctuate, but the main takeaway is we didn't see much of an expectation. I would say on behalf of those head-to-head polls that this was the final result, but through ranked choice voting, one could have gotten an idea that it was either going to be Adams and Wiley or Adams and Garcia. And there was also something that needed to be pointed out about the downfall of Andrew Yang in this mayoral primary to a point where, he came in with an extremely large advantage. When you take a look at some of these endorsements as well that Andrew Yang received in this race, you'll see that representatives have endorsed him. He has state legislators, he has local officials. He has people that are recognizable in New York City. But the problem is that this level of endorsement, these endorsements from some people who may not necessarily be the more notable people in New York City, it wasn't enough to provide him that election boost, that even to a point where Maya Wiley was able to receive the endorsement from Jamal Bowman, or receive the endorsement from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or receive the endorsement from Hakeem Jeffries. In these regions, Maya Wiley was able to get the endorsement from many of these representatives that Andrew Yang simply couldn't and do better. The same applies to Eric Adams and even Kathryn Garcia, who didn't have as many notable endorsements, but still ended up doing well. But then again, she did campaign with Andrew Yang, so a significant portion of his voters did move over to her. But not necessarily enough that I would say her entire reason for being in that second place position was solely because of Andrew Yang. Many other factors went into this race. But you can see here that this was a pretty spread out primary where representatives and senators were endorsing various people, including Andrew Yang, even though many people viewed him as someone who couldn't necessarily be truly from New York City. That was a big part of the Yang campaign, proving to the voters in New York City that he truly is one of them, that he truly cares about the city itself. And it was honestly, a lot of media attention on Andrew Yang that I would say did hurt him significantly. If anyone was to be focused on this in this mayoral election, it was Andrew Yang. Eric Adams, Catherine Garcia, Maya Wiley all significantly lacked that social media presence and national presence. But what they had over Yang was citywide presence. When there is a mayoral election, you can't treat it like a presidential election. And that's what many people expected to see from Andrew Yang, a pivot in terms of issues, a pivot in terms of the way that he strategized and campaigned. Started out the front runner, ended up losing in fourth place. But for Eric Adams, what are his odds of becoming the next mayor of New York City? I talked about how essentially he is the shoo-in, and I wasn't kidding. In 2017, Bill de Blasio won 66.5% of the vote over Nicole Maliotakis, who is now actually a representative from the state of New York. But Bill de Blasio won here with just around 67% of support, a very significant portion of support. And 2013 was actually the first time that a Democrat won in New York City's mayoral election since 1989. Now, I know that seems weird. New York City, large Democratic region, it doesn't really make sense that this is an area where Republicans have had a strong grip on it, but understand who they were. It was Rudy Giuliani going to the 90s into the 2000s. Then it was Michael Bloomberg, a very well-known name, someone who was actually able to run for 3 terms due to rule changes. So then Bill de Blasio stepped in as a Democrat in 2013, ran against Joe Lijada. I believe that's how you pronounce his name, ended up winning, and now it's starting to bring back this streak of Democratic victories in New York City because, honestly speaking, Curtis Sliwa does not have a chance at victory in New York City. Knowing the demographic breakdown, knowing the political breakdown of New York City, I see no reason as to why anyone should expect Curtis Sliwa to end up winning this regular election. It simply doesn't make sense. I don't even think we'll see many polls, if a poll at all, in this general election because it doesn't really make sense. But these implications from the New York City mayoral race is that potentially some cities aren't necessarily ready for progressive Democratic candidates, or maybe just that there are a couple of things that they need to improve upon in order to win in future elections. Wiley received 29% of the vote compared to 30.4%. Arguably, she was within reach. Who knows how she would have performed had she moved on to that final round with Catherine Garcia votes being split, but we know that Eric Adams and Garcia were certainly not the progressive candidates that the rest of the left wing actually wanted in these races. Many people wanted Maya Wiley, even went down to lesser-known candidates such as Dianne Morales and others who seem to be more left-leaning than the rest. And while Garcia, I wouldn't exactly say is an exact centrist Democrat, I wouldn't exactly call her a staunch progressive either. And the same can be applied to Eric Adams. I mean, he has received a lot of criticism from many members of the race, but the reason why I think that he did so well is because of this astounding first round of vote, getting nearly 1/3 of the vote around the entire city. Wiley came in second in the first round with just 21% of the vote, 1 in 5 voters compared to nearly 1 in 3 for Eric Adams. And then Garcia was also around 1 in 5. Yang was around 1 in 9. So pretty much these results weren't super favorable for the rest of the candidates, largely because Eric Adams had a lead that only required him to win a smaller portion of the votes than the rest. This lead was nearly 10 points over Wiley and more than 10 points plus for, depending on the candidate, over the rest of the candidates. And by the time the final rounds were reached, you'll see here that while 69% of the first round vote wasn't Eric Adams, and, arguably against Catherine Garcia, more than that, 80% of the vote, because of ranked choice voting, it allowed Eric Adams and Catherine Garcia to end up in a position where it was pretty competitive. But ranked choice voting in this instance didn't change the outcome of what would otherwise be declared the winner. In 2013, in this Democratic primary, Bill de Blasio won through a plurality system. He was not in the lead at all. In fact, started out in 4th place in a very similar fashion to Eric Adams, had a last-minute surge that ultimately ended up with him winning a plurality of the vote citywide. He received 41% of the vote. Bill Thompson received 26%. Christine Quinn received 16%. And then as you go down, you'll get into single digits. But de Blasio won by a simple plurality. Had this election been held that way, Eric Adams would have won by a plurality as well. But he also won by the final majority vote. So ranked choice voting in this instance did not change the outcome of the winner, so it can't be used as a way to explain how someone who can come in first can end up losing the race, but it can provide a little bit more context as to how voters would vote if they were given this option, who they would rank, how many ballots would no longer be counted. Is this truly going to represent democracy if ballots don't end up being counted? A lot of questions will be arisen because of the way that this primary was held, but I also do want to point out that the Board of Elections was the reason why this New York primary was held in a very unfortunate fashion. It was not the fault of ranked choice voting. Please don't misconstrue that. Ranked choice voting has been implemented in Maine and has worked well. It is also now being implemented in the state of Alaska. It has been implemented in some other smaller portions of the country. So while New York City seemed like a mess, it was not because of the ranked choice voting, but rather the part of the New York City Board of Elections, which had major missteps. Not to put the blame on any singular person or, while it is in many cases the fault of the Board of Elections, understand that this is something that they are typically new with, but there have been concerns way before this primary that had to do with the Board of Elections that counted in, how late they counted the votes, the methods that they use, the lack of transparency, many major issues, human errors. I mean, so many things went wrong with just this city mayoral primary that, yes, there should be some type of discussion of reform and change within the Board of Elections, but I do want to say that this is not something that is a fault of ranked choice voting, that I've seen some arguments about that. It simply isn't true. This is a method that will probably be implemented around the country in other forms. We will see it actually utilized on a statewide level in the state of Alaska, which will likely end up with multiple rounds. Unfortunately, in Maine in 2020, there weren't multiple rounds because Susan Collins won by a simple majority, so we didn't get to see it fully pan out. But again, the entire purpose of ranked choice voting is that a candidate receives a majority. So it worked in Maine, but we didn't see the rounds continue like we do now. Eric Adams defeats Catherine Garcia by just 1 percentage point. Every single vote matters. Nearly 1 million votes cast across the entire state, and the margin of victory is just 8,000 votes. Like I said, every single vote matters. We'll see what happens here. About 3,000 votes outstanding that need to be fixed. I believe these are absentee ballots and might have some type of issues with the signature and everything, but it's not enough to change the outcome, given that Eric Adams has around an 8,000 vote lead. So you shouldn't expect anything to drastically change about the results, maybe slight percentages. Other than that, we do know that at the end of the day, it is 99.9% likely that Eric Adams is the next mayor of New York City. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2021 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.